I do want to spend a little bit of time in the broader context, and when starting in 1948, maybe even before then, in terms of like the genesis of Zionism. But what's the value of that project? In other words, like this has been a question that in terms of Israel, and as a Jew who was raised, with a Hebrew education in the 70s. I've said this on the program many times. I had Hebrew teachers who had tattoos from the Holocaust, and we learned about the Holocaust, which was the premise, and that was only 30 years. When I was my son's age, had only been 30 years earlier. Now we're 40 years, 50 years out, close to when I learned those things, and just to give a sense of time to an audience that might be younger than I. But the second thing was Israel, and there was, for as long as I can remember, there was always a sort of like an argument as to who had the moral righteousness in the debate. And over time, I found that sort of like a fool's errand. But what is important to know about the founding of Israel? Because there's also, I think, been an analogous sort of to a Dunning school in this country in terms of Reconstruction and the Civil War. And there was a version of that with the founding of Israel. So, first tell us about like the importance of knowing this history.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there are two sort of elements that are important to remember in a very short and abrupt kind of a crash history course. One is that Zionism emerged in the late 19th century as an ideological movement that was seeking a safe haven for Jews who were persecuted by anti-Semitism, and also had a new idea that excited all Europe at the time, that actually Judaism is not a religion, but actually nationalism. So if you combine the two ideas, that you're looking for a safe haven, which is not in Europe, because Europe is not safe, and you're looking for a new idea of a new definition of Judaism, then Palestine comes naturally to their mind because of the connection to the Bible in the Jewish faith. That's one element, the element of looking for a panacea, a response to anti-Semitism, and for a Europe that doesn't want you to be part of it. So, and by the way, this is not unique to Zionism. Settler colonial movements that were seeking safe haven from European persecution founded the United States, as well as Canada and Australia and New Zealand. The second element is, and exactly coming back to this comparison with these other settler colonial movements, is that Zionism, like other movements of refugees from Europe, opted for a country that already was inhabited by another people. And they chose an historical moment by which these people were already building a modern identity, a national identity, and had their aspiration, like the rest of the world at the time, for independent self-determination. The moment Zionism insisted that the only place for a safe Jewish haven is Palestine, it became a colonialist, I would say settler colonialist movement that clashed with the indigenous native people of Palestine. And like most settler colonial movements, as happened in the United States, it shows the elimination of the native as the best way of fulfilling its dream for a safe, modern Jewish state. It was unable to fulfill this idea in full, and we are all the time within that parameter. A Jewish national movement trying to get as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians in it, and an anti-colonialist Palestinian movement doing all it can, sometimes with better means, sometimes with quite terrible means, to try and defend itself from that project. There was if I may just one more sentence, Sam, there was a great scholar of settler colonialism, the late Patrick Wolf, and he said that settler colonialism is not an event, it's a structure. It doesn't happen in one day. as long as there is a DNA for the settler colonialist that totally erases the native, the indigenous, from its future, then there's always a danger of annihilation for the natives, and always a danger that the native or indigenous would fight back with everything at their disposal.
Was that element of the DNA, the elimination of the indigenous, was that always exclusive within Zionism? I mean, when I look back at the charter in the around World War I of the Zionist charter, there was a sense of like, we're looking for a land where rights are respected regardless of race or religion. There are equal rights in that thing. I mean, do you need that element within the DNA of this movement to eliminate the indigenous, or is it to qualify as settler colonialism, or can the idea of like, we're going to this is going to be a home, but it's going to be a multicultural, for lack of a better term, sort of environment, that it's not necessarily going to be exclusively a Jewish state?
First of all, let me explain. Elimination of the native is not necessarily genocide, as happened in North America. Elimination of the native, as in the case of Palestine, can be also translated to ethnic cleansing, that is, transfer of people, or enclaving them, or sieging them in Gaza. Ironically, Sam, what is really ironic is that from the very beginning, the leaders and the thinkers of the Zionist movement were envisioning a democratic state that was highly important for them. And for a democratic state, you need the demography to equate the democracy. In other words, you need a constant majority of Jews, at least a constant majority, if not exclusive Jewish presence there. This is so ironic in a way. I'll give you a concrete example for this. Had Israel not expelled by force 750,000 Palestinians during the Nakba, the catastrophe, during 1948, in the first Israeli election in 1949, the Jews would not have been the majority. Now, it's quite likely the Palestinians would not have voted for a Jewish state. By the way, they would have voted gladly for a democratic, pluralistic state. But this was not an option as far as the Zionist movement is concerned. This is exactly the issue. The issue is that it's terrible in the 21st century to believe that there could be an ideology that is allowed to say, whoever is my citizens, I don't care. But there is a superiority that I ensure to my own race, my own faith, my own religion. This is unacceptable. This is really unacceptable. And yet, I don't have to tell you this, Israel is commodified as the only democracy in the Middle East. But it is an ethnic racist state that believes that your Jewishness is the ticket for being member of the Republic, if you want. And that is just a modern face of the old settler colonial idea. Let's get rid of the indigenous, and then we can build a beautiful Jewish democracy in Palestine.
Well, as you say, it's an ethno-state, and I'm wondering if you could return to the original intent of Israel by in the Balfour Declaration and at the nation's founding. My understanding is that there were some very anti-Semitic undertones in the way that the British conceived of Israel. Is that accurate, and is that important in understanding the context of how Israel is constituted today?
Yes, Emma, I think it's very important. It's even beyond the Balfour Declaration. People tend to forget that Zionism began as a project of evangelical Christianity, long before Jewish intellectuals suggested the idea of creating a Jewish state in Palestine, this was quite a vision supported by many evangelical Christians on both sides of the Atlantic. And the motivation was anti-Semitic in a way, because in the vision of evangelical Christianity, a millennialist view could only be implemented if the Jews would return to Palestine. It had to be, or the Holy Land, as they would have called it. Namely, you could not have the end of time, the resurrection of the dead, the return of the Messiah, without the return of the Jews to Palestine. Now, and we should add, and their conversion into Christianity, that was part of the deal. But it created a good pretext to encourage the idea that the Jews should not live either in the United States or in Europe. They should go to Palestine. So it was a kind, I used to call it the double bill for anti-Semites, because they get rid of the Jews, and so to speak, they get back the only Jew they want, which is Jesus Christ. This is very important. Now, this kind of group was very important among the British policymakers. And Lord Balfour, who is behind the Balfour Declaration, was a very known anti-Semite. His greatest worry was that anti-Semitism in Russia would push hundreds of thousands of Jews into Britain. So he legislated in 1906 the Aliens Act in the British Parliament that was specifically meant to disallow British refugees from Russia to come to Britain. Not surprisingly, when he began his connection with the Zionist movement, he saw even a better solution than trying by force to prevent Jews from Eastern Europe to come to Britain. It was better to reorientate them to Palestine. On top of it, he was told by British imperialist strategists that a Jewish Palestine would justify the integration or the incorporation of of Palestine within the British Empire. Because we have to remember, we're talking at a time when Palestine is still part of the Ottoman Empire, but those who fight against Turkey, Austro-Hungary, and Germany begin to envision how they will divide the spoils, who would have what. And a strong connection with the Zionist movement enabled Britain to say to France and other allies, Palestine should be part of the British sphere of influence because of its special connection with the Zionist movement.
And we should say that impetus is perhaps one of the biggest drivers of within American politics now. The Christian Zionist movement has a similar thing. Now I think it's also fair to say that like there was in Judaism since the destruction of the Second Temple, at the very least a metaphorical sort of desire to return to Jerusalem, right? I mean, we say this in the Jewish holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Passover, next year in Jerusalem, but it was always less a political movement and more of a metaphorical idea.